the chat. So welcome everybody. It is lovely to see lots of people flooding in for today's talk. After a bit of a summer hiatus, our Etc. talks are back. So for those that aren't familiar, Etc. is the umbrella name for all of the artist interviews that we run here at Draw Brighton. And the Etc. programme is funded by the generosity of our Patreon supporters, of which Phil is actually one. And the talks are available for everyone to view for free. So tonight I've got the pleasure of speaking to Philip Tyler, educator and artist and course leader of BA Printmaking at the University of Brighton. So Phil, welcome.
Thanks very much, Jake. Thanks for inviting me.
It is an absolute pleasure. And I just thought, I'm assuming lots of people are familiar with your work, but for those that aren't, would you be able to just give me a little introduction to your artistic practice?
Well, I mean, I can show you some images if you want. That's probably not a bad starting point. I can do that.
That sounds fab.
Share screen, and let's just go share.
Bingo, we're there. That's wonderful.
So if you were to say to me, what do? I would say I'm a figurative artist. And if I go backwards, before I was a figurative artist, I was an abstract artist. So during my degree, I spent about 7 years being an abstract artist, and then gradually out of that idea around abstraction, sort of figuration emerged. And so I've been kind of working with the figure since the early 90s. Mostly I've worked with the male nude and quite significantly myself, so the self-portrait. So these are sort of paintings from the early 90s. And partly it was the idea of kind of sort of trying to sort of be honest with myself and try to sort of find something that was no longer about art. I mean, it sounds an odd thing, but my MA sort of finished me off as an artist. So I felt I couldn't make art with capital letters anymore. So I was going to paint what I saw. But ultimately, that also coincided with some significant life changes. So my mum died when I was 29, and so the figure became the vehicle through which I could explore aspects of grief. So there's only so much you can do from the self. So I spent a lot of time kind of working from the self, and then I've gone off and done other things. So I also, paint landscapes and I paint still life. The most recent series of works, which are probably, I guess, the ones that are mostly well known, have been largely made over the last 5 years since I've worked at the University of Brighton. I don't know if you want me to keep flicking through and talk about this series of works, or whether there's any questions that you've got.
It's great seeing all these pieces, and it's really interesting hearing you talk about the shift from abstraction to kind of figuration. I mean, where would you draw the boundary? Because looking at some of these works, I can really see the abstract influences in the figurative work. Like, where would you kind of place a cutoff point between abstraction and figuration?
Well, I suppose I always talk about those things as being part and parcel of the same package of things, that you're ultimately making images. So whether you're making a gestural abstract, print or painting, or whether you're making a figurative image, for me, those formal concerns are exactly the same. I mean, one of my big influences as an artist was Richard Diebenkorn. I did my BA thesis on Diebenkorn, and I actually wrote to him as well, and I've got a handwritten letter from Richard Diebenkorn. And what struck me as being particularly relevant to him, or for me, from him, was that he was a figurative artist and he went abstract. He gained quite a significant career as an abstract artist. Then midway through his career, he went figurative, and then when he's then established a reputation as a significant figurative artist, he went abstract again. I guess the thing is the idea of, I think the kind of problem I found myself in was that as a student, I had this naive idea that you were trying to find your signature style, and that was the solution. And when you found that was it, you could then produce ad infinitum numerous iterations of the same painting. And of course, what you realized is that it was a sort of solipsistic thing. It was just a self-repetitive thing, and there was nothing that was going to feed into that vocabulary. And one of the things that I suppose I got from Diebenkorn was that there was a sense that his abstractions were informed by the scene world. So whether it was the early Urbana or Berkeley series that come from his time as a photographer, or whether, you know, he's searching around the studio trying to find inspiration in still lives or the views out of his studio window. And obviously he did a lot of life drawing as well, which informed the figure studies. Or later on, where he's looking at, you know, the San Francisco landscape and drawing kind of shapes and color relationships from the urban environment. For me, the idea that when I got to the end of my MA, I felt that my work was merely a sort of a hodgepodge of other people's work. It was like things that looked a bit like art. And when I realized, you know, at the end of my MA that it was all quite vacuous, the idea of no longer doing that, but instead making work that was a direct response to things that I could see. For me, I wasn't trying to make something that looked a bit arty. I was simply just being open to responding to something. But inevitably, you're still making images. So you're still thinking about the composition, you're still thinking about the arrangement of marks, you're still thinking about color relationships. So at the heart, I'm still a formalist artist, you know, and I still make abstract work, but often within the remit of being a teacher. So, you know, I mean, you know, like today, I mean, I've been getting students to draw music. So we've been thinking about mark making in an abstract sense. So I don't really see wholeheartedly that there's a difference on my favorite artists are abstracts and my favorite artists are figurative.
That's such a wonderful answer. Thank you. I wonder as well, you're talking about the struggles as a student of kind of having to pin down a style or having to come to terms with the idea that style might not be something that you achieve at the end of your BA and then sort of can just carry forward into a career. Is that a kind of narrative that you find the students that you're teaching right now struggle with as well?
Well, one of the things, I mean, I'm quite, I won't say brutal, but one of the things I say very early on is don't be looking for style. You know, style is a cul-de-sac that you put yourself into, you know, and often I think it's very limiting. And in fact, you know, one of the narrative that I've been having, you know, for the last couple of weeks, we're 5 weeks into a new academic year, and I lead I've run the course, but I lead the first year students through their first experiences. And I talk about the fact that if you do what you know how to do, you know how to do that. You're not going to learn anything. You've got the opportunity to take risks. You've got the opportunity to explore, and forcing it. I mean, I personally, one of the things that I don't really like is when you see someone who seems to have applied a style to their work so that everything looks the same. It's like the same color choices, the same sort of marks, and it feels like they're not responding to the subject. And I mean, I talk about that in life drawing. Obviously, you know, I teach life drawing at the university, but I say that if you think about, you know, if you're drawing using partial peak, or you're drawing using blind drawing, or you're doing a measured drawing, or you're doing a, you know, a tonal drawing using the side of the charcoal. For me, one of my ex-colleagues talked about the fact that different people have different nervous systems. I talk about it as mindsets that are sort of a different drawing style might suit a particular mindset. So if you're feeling, you know, sometimes I want to listen to Elbow, sometimes I want to listen to Steve Reich, sometimes I want to listen to Niels Frahm. So if I'm feeling particularly quiet and contemplative, then a measured drawing will be really suitable to how I approach that problem. Sometimes I want to be energetic and boisterous, and working with the side of the charcoal and physically erasing and pushing the media around absolutely suits that. If that's, do you know what I mean? So it's not adopting a mannerism, it's simply being open to what the subject gives you. So I think for me, the absolute driver of work is the subject. So, you know, a still life might be painted differently to a landscape, a figure painting might be painted differently. And, you know, obviously, if you're getting into portraiture, there's a different, you know, problem there, because you're wrestling with that idea of likeness. Can you capture the likeness of a person, and how do you pin that down?
I think the phrase you used earlier, response, seems so pertinent, that actually rather than trying to impose a vision on the subject, you are responding to it. So I guess that
absolutely. And I think that's the thing, is for me, the stimulus for work are visual things. So whether in this particular series, I mean, this particular series started when I started working at the university, because I happened to visit the disabled toilet in the Edward Street buildings at the university. And not that I want to go into my bowel disease problems, but the toilet is a bit like walking inside a Francis Bacon painting, because it's a black cube. And so you walk into this space and there's this incredible kind of sense of drama through the way that the space is lit. So you've got this kind of very strong kind of dramatic lighting, you've got this very black space. So the nature of that space and my reflection in the bathroom suggested a series of photographs, and in those photographs became this series of paintings. You know, and you know, when you suddenly then change that space. So if I move on, during lockdown, obviously I've not been at the university. So over lockdown, you suddenly, if I just move on a few more slides, you know, so now this series are my bathroom. So the space in the bathroom, the light in the bathroom, the objects in the bathroom is a different sort of space. So although the subject is the same, how it's treated is slightly different.
And you've got quite a history of bathroom self-portraits, haven't you?
Yeah, well, well, for a number of reasons. I think number one, when I first, well, for a long time, I never had a studio. So when I first moved to Brighton, and we had a one-bedroom flat in Brighton, and I was struggling with the idea of how do I make work, because I was, you know, working in London, commuting every day. My 5 foot by 7 foot bathroom became my studio. So literally on a Saturday night, I would convert my bathroom into the studio by putting a 4 foot by 8 foot chipboard, you know, board on top of the bath, another one propped up on that, and then that would be where I clamped an angle poise lamp, and that's where I would put big panels of paper. So on Sunday morning, I'd get up about 6 o'clock, because I got up at 6 o'clock for the rest of the week, and I would spend 6 hours painting in the studio. And then, you know, the studio would be dismantled. I'd get my wife up, because she would be working as well in London, and then we'd have the rest of the day to kind of do what you do on a Sunday, which is have cups of tea, look out the window, read the paper, etc. So the bathroom, yes, was a significant place. But again, I think that small windowless room had a particular influence. With the toilet, I mean, you know, the toilet was a space that you have to go to. But I was to say, I've had Crohn's disease for over 25 years. So there's a significance to the fact that it's a toilet, you know, and there's a significance to the fact that you've got this isolated box. You know, I'm fascinated by the idea of, you know, the bathroom as being a place where, you know, you are naked and yet you are kind of quite vulnerable. You know, you go into the shower, you have the bath, you're very conscious of your own self. When you see yourself reflected, often it's not the most glamorous thing to look at when you look at yourself in the bathroom mirror. So again, there's that sense of reflective self, you know, and I think particularly, and I've said this before numerous times, but, you know, death has been a subject matter that's underpinned a lot of the work. My mum died when I was 29. My brother died 8 years ago. My dad died 6 years ago. I'm the only person in my family that's alive, you know, in terms of, and, you know, my brother died when he was 56 and I've just turned 57. So that sense of mortality, you know, with Crohn's disease, asthma, you know, being clinically vulnerable, being shielded, all of those things are playing in your mind. So I guess, yeah, bathrooms and self-reflection are reoccurring motifs.
Thanks for talking about all of that as well, because I think often people discuss big themes in relation to work, but I think how do you actually kind of manifest those ideas in the work itself? Is it that the process of looking is kind of cathartic, or is it just giving you space to kind of think and reflect, or is it something else? Like, how do you channel kind of grief through or reflections on life and death through visual work?
I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, obviously going back, I mean, as I say, I started. It was a weird thing in that the really long story is that I hadn't intended to be a figurative painter at all. What happened is that in the very first series of images I showed you, which had these images of trees, I'd wanted to have figures in the space, and figures started to emerge in the space. So there was a sense where I thought in the figure paintings that I was doing them, these abstracted figures, that the figures didn't seem that convincing. I didn't really know how to draw figures, so I felt I needed to draw a figure to make the imagery more convincing. And because I was commuting so much at the time, I was living in Brighton and working in London, I thought, well, the answer is to draw, you know, and obviously I'll draw myself, and I'm the only model that I can use. So initially I was making these life-size life drawings in the bathroom. And I can remember a work colleague was leaving, and I'd not long ago seen the Sickert show. This is sort of early 90s. And I remember thinking, oh, you know, he's an art historian, and he might quite like a small little gift to say goodbye. And I will paint him a Sickert, you know, because I had, at the time when we lived in Brighton, I'd filled my house up with fakes. So I wanted a Sickert, so I painted myself a Sickert. I wanted a Bonnard, so I painted a Bonnard. You know, I couldn't afford one, but I could paint one, you know. So I was going to do a Sickert for him, and I decided at the last minute I wouldn't do that. I'd paint a self-portrait, and this was the first time I painted a self-portrait, you know, and it was about 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters, and I painted this thing, and I thought, oh my God, suddenly there was something really compelling about this thing. It was almost as if like lots of different threads of ideas came together. I started then to think there's something here that's really interesting. So I started to make the first of the figure paintings. And at that time, I called the series of works the Changing Room series. And what I was very conscious of is, as I'm sure most males will talk about, the idea that as a kid, when you're at school, when you're in the changing room can be quite a vulnerable place. That the bully can be whipping you with the towel, you know, you're trying not to acknowledge the fact that you're surrounded by naked men. You're trying to get into your own little zone. But equally, it's quite an odd situation to find yourself in, you know. But then that coincided with my mum dying. So suddenly, when my mum died, and you had this immense sense of grief, you know, completely out of the blue. Literally, I was on the phone to my mum the night before she died. The question is, when you're dealing with grief for the first time, how do you explain that? I found that you couldn't explain it in words, but maybe it felt like this, or it felt like that. You know, it felt that you could explore that feeling through how the body sat. So that's where it started, the idea that the body could hold the emotion. And to a certain extent, I mean, I guess that's what it is now, you know. I mean, weirdly, actually, when my brother died, I couldn't paint figures. I painted very quiet, very reflective still lifes. I did a whole series of, you know, these metal objects that were reflecting, you know, the surroundings. And because when my brother died, I felt very different. You know, when my dad died, I felt very different. When my dad died, I did a lot of walking in the landscape. And for me, walking the dog in the landscape, particularly when it was stormy, you know, getting out onto Sisbury Ring, that felt like a good thing to do, you know. So when my dad died, there was the landscape. So I guess it's like different motifs can hold different emotions, but I don't think that death is the same every time you experience it. You know, I mean, unfortunately for us as a family, you know, my wife's parents have died. You know, I mean, my mother-in-law died 11 years ago. About 16 years ago, my father-in-law died. So grief has been something that's been there, you know, for quite a long time. And as I say, in every instance, there have been different ramifications of that. What a happy chappy I am, Jake.
I did, no, it's so wonderful to hear you talking about it. Thank you for, I don't know, talking so candidly about it as well, Phil. It's really interesting as well to hear how you are making visual responses to all of these experiences as well. You know, you're talking about walking in the landscape as a way of sort of experiencing something, but then the fact that you're channeling that into work, it seems to really break down the boundary between experience and kind of life as something experienced, and then the making of work. You're not just sort of making separate studio time for experiencing something and then channeling that into work. It seems like it's implicit in your day to day that you make work.
I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I've often wondered whether we make images because we're not very good at communicating with the world. I'm naturally a very shy person. I find meeting people in social situations utterly awful. It's only having had children and a dog that's meant I can actually communicate with other people. So I think you start by making images because that's how you communicate with yourself. And to a certain extent, I think you could probably think about these images are almost me communicating with myself, kind of playing around with ideas around narrative. But for me, yeah, it's, there is no separation. It's like, you know, when I'm teaching, everything that I'm doing in terms of my teaching has come from my experience of being an artist and the sort of the various blind avenues that I've trodden down, or the various things that I've kind of experimented with, you know. I mean, my wife described me as an obsessive, and I think I am an obsessive. I think I'm certainly an obsessive image maker. I can't stop myself, you know what I mean? And actually, you know, I mean, one of the sort of the things that I purchased in January was an iPad, and you know, the iPad and the Procreate you know, software and the Apple Pencil has been one of my saving graces, because I'd rather sit of an evening and do some drawing than sit and watch crap telly, you know, because it's like life is too short. The one thing I would say that actually is the downside of stuff is I haven't read very much. I've done far too much drawing and painting to read, you know, and that's my sort of my shortfall, I guess.
Pop an audio book on in the background.
Maybe somebody's talked to me about that, but again, it's sort of, yeah, probably should do, you know.
I guess that depends on how you work as well, though. I mean, do you have music on as you work? Do you like kind of silent?
I mean, I do love music on. I mean, quite often, I mean, one of the things I also relish is silence, particularly when you've got 3 kids, because the noise in the house can be, you know, quite excessive at times. So both myself and my wife comment on the fact that often on the weekend, first thing in the morning, there's nothing better than not having the telly on and just sitting in silence and just being quiet, you know. But yeah, in the studio, if I can, I love to have music on. But I do tend to listen to quite a lot of sort of contemporary classical music rather than sort of pop songs, you know.
And you were talking about drawing with students, working from music, just responding to the sound. Does it feed into your work? I mean, do you kind of find that the type of music you're listening to kind of feeds into the marks you're making, or the attitude you take?
I think that, you know, I suppose going back to what I said before, what mood are you in when you make work? So that link between sort of, you know, are you feeling jubilant, and therefore do you listen to jubilant music, and therefore does the work? So I mean, I'm a big fan of miserable music, and you know, so I love melancholy in music, and I think that often permeates the work, you know. I mean, I don't know whether it's, you know, it's a kind of historical thing. I think if I think probably back to my family life as a child, it wasn't the most happiest family, so maybe that's had its kind of impact on me, you know. So yeah, I think, but then, you know, if I'm making landscape paintings, then the atmosphere, I think, of the landscapes is quite different.
I mean, as you're flicking through as well, everyone can see just how prolific you are with all of these images. I'm also thinking, I mean, you're so performative in a way as model for yourself. It feels like there is a big element of private performance going on within there.
I think, I mean, and I've said this a few times before, but what would be fabulous, I mean, if you think about artists like Michael Boromans, where he's got, you know, a group of actors who can perform for him, and then he can film those actors performing, or someone like Eric Fischel who can hire a couple of models and a lovely apartment for his models. That would be a great situation to have. You know, I'd love to have that, but the reality is I teach full time. You know, I mean, I haven't got the time to be able to hire actors and hire venues. So yeah, I think there is a performative aspect to the work. I mean, if anything, as I say, when I started painting the figure, what I realized is that in a very, very sort of convoluted way, I'd been a gestural abstract painter. So it felt that within these paintings, there was a gestural abstraction in terms of the mark making. I'd also been a very sort of minimal kind of color field artist. And I think within the work, there's a kind of underpinning geometry and a color field aspect to the work. So it felt like a lot of different threads kind of come together. As a kid at school, I did drama. I've been an actor. I've sung on stage, not in a grandiose way, but there is a bit of, and I think as a teacher, I'm a performer. As I say, privately, I'm absolutely useless, but stick me in front of 200 students and I gesticulate wildly and carry an audience. So yeah, I think there is a performative aspect, you know, and as I say, I think that idea of one of the interesting things is, for a long time, you know, I've been interested in narrative, you know, and about trying to develop a sense of narrative. So, you know, sometimes the single figure has the reflection, but the reflection isn't always the true reflection of what the other figure's doing. You know, and that was some of the digital drawings as well, where I've been trying to experiment with the creation of different narratives. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the prolific nature of the work, I think there's a number of things there. One, I think that there's always been that challenge when you teach full time, and I've taught full time since 1990. You know, you feel that somehow or other you don't want teaching to be everything that you do. Mm-hmm. So there's that real tension in terms of you feel the need to make work, but equally you feel the need to make a lot of work to feel that actually you're moving the work forward. I think also over time I've learned how to work very quickly. So there is an expediency sometimes to the work, in that if the work isn't right, then I will go back and I will rework things and I will sand things down and I will repaint things. But equally, there's that sense as well that now, particularly as I'm, you know, getting older, you want to make sure that everything that you've done is good. You know, the idea that one of these days I'll die and there's a whole load of really terrible paintings lying around, I don't want any of that, you know. So, but yeah, I do think I'm an obsessive image maker. So, you know, things kind of feed into what I do.
It seems appropriate that you've just clicked onto these, because I think that sense of repetition in the paintings really puts me in mind of the multiple that is kind of implicit in printmaking. So hitting these prints here, I mean, tell me about your role in printmaking at the university as well, your relationship to printmaking, because we've seen a lot of your paintings here.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously I did my BA in fine art. I did my MA in printmaking, and I did my MA in printmaking largely because I couldn't get onto an MA in painting. However, saying that, I think that the MA in painting did two things. It did me a lot of good and it also did me a lot of harm. In one respect, having to take apart my painting and having to reflect on how do I turn a painting into a print started to make me really think about what was important in the work and what was superfluous. So if anything, the experience of doing printmaking simplified the painting problems down. So I became more efficient in painting. I am an obsessive image maker. So you often see me exploring the same motif over again. And I've often worked serially, so sort of revisiting the same sets of images. And I'm very process driven. I've always been really excited by process. So the transformative process of taking one thing into something else and back again. I think the thing is that what I suppose I talk about at University of Brighton is that the degree in printmaking is an image making course. Our students are image makers. So whether they're making images through drawing, whether they're making images through painting, whether they're making images through collage, whether they're using photographic processes or autographic processes, whether they're using traditional print or, as I say, digital technology. For me, the driver of all of it is image making. And so that's how I approach it, as someone who's spent a lifetime teaching a variety of different image making processes. I've spent 30 odd years teaching printmaking. And for me, printmaking is a great way of just exploring images and the potential of images. So I guess that's how I teach it in terms of my first year teaching. That what I'm focusing on is just giving students a much broader understanding, hopefully, of just different ways of making images. And also getting students to think about, what do you do with the images that you've made?
Mm-hmm.
So drawing is a really good example, that you can make a drawing, and often students tend to think of drawing as being a finished thing. You know, it's like, here is my drawing and now I'm going to frame it, as opposed to, I've made a whole series of drawings and I can do this with the drawings and I can translate it in this way or that way. So recently, obviously, you know, I mean, I've been experimenting with, you know, cross processes. I've always been interested in cross processes. So to that extent, this is a dry point, but this is a screen print of the dry point. So I'm using the dry point plate as the screen positive. This is the same stencil, but with more layers. So this is something which is going into the 2020 print exchange at the moment.
Right.
Yeah, this actually is not quite the finished screen print, but obviously it's the same composition. But, you know, one is kind of experimenting with, you know, I mean, I started these over the summer, and over the summer, I was making a whole load of instructional videos, because often, particularly with lockdown, you know, our students had quite limited access to workshops and limited time in the workshops. So I put together a whole load of videos to remind students of processes. So, you know, how do you coat a screen? How do you clean a screen? How do you set up the press? How do you degrease a plate? You know, how do you put a soft ground on? All those sorts of things. So as part of that, you know, I'm making up my own prints, but equally I'm building teaching materials and resources for the students. You know, again, these ones aren't finished, but I've got other. The prints are finished now, but this is not the finished state, as it were. Yeah, so again, this is one that I sort of filmed in terms of me making this print, and, you know, photographed it as well.
I feel like one of the things you said there actually sounded quite radical to me, which was that the printmaking degree was an image making degree, because I remember meeting an artist on our art foundation course, which was probably about 12 years ago, 13 years ago or something, that I did art foundation.
Yeah.
And the artist, who was primarily a painter, was very anti the notion that he was an image maker, and he was almost quite dismissive of image makers. And I think maybe that sort of played into some of the narratives of the kind of conceptualism of the 90s, which set up a kind of false dichotomy between the image and the concept. And I mean, you're talking about a lot of ideas, a lot of concepts here, but tying that quite tightly to image making. And it's quite exciting actually to hear a fine art course being explicitly called an image making course, because that is, of course, what you're dealing with there. It sounds like quite a radical thing to say.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's particularly radical, but I mean, remember that at the University of Brighton, we actually have 3 fine art courses at the University of Brighton. So there was more. In fact, we did have a fine art sculpture course. We had a fine art critical. We had a fine art critical practice course. We had a fine art painting course, a fine art printmaking course. So the critical fine art practice course and the sculpture course have now become the new degree in fine art, but they come at things very much from the idea of a more performative, object-based course. Painting, you know, has a very sort of strong sense of its tradition within painting. You know, there's quite a broad range of painting practice. But I think the thing about printmaking is that, you know, you get some students who do develop a real interest in the photographic. You know, you do get some students who get a real interest in the materiality of the process. Some get really excited by the process. Some don't really make prints at all. But, you know, it's a little bit like one of my university colleagues did tapestry at the Royal College, and tapestry was this place that captured lots of students who didn't sit neatly into other fine art areas, you know. So his practice was sort of image making, but with material. So he used sort of fabric, he used glass, he used metal. You know, his work operated in a sort of painterly way, but he wasn't using paint. you know, and equally sort of tapestry students were using various traditions of tapestry, but to make images. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being obsessed by making images.
And particularly because it drives so much of our culture at the moment. You know, we are in a heavily image-based culture, and to be teaching students to be literate in images, I think seems like a very important skill to be fostering right now.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and I say also kind of questioning the nature of the images that you see is quite an interesting one too.
Do you see drawing to be a big part of that as well? You talked about it as a kind of foundational skill
I'm
earlier.
really, really passionate about drawing, and I've always been passionate about drawing. I think you have to decide early on what your beliefs are, and I guess one of the things that I feel is that in my own practice, drawing is the thing that provided me with the answers. I remember when I did my MA, my wife said to me, she said, the problem with you, Phil, is that your work doesn't show your strengths. And what I was doing constantly throughout the MA was drawing. I mean, I was spending every day on the train drawing people. And I remember my tutors on my MA saying, your drawing doesn't inform your practice. And actually what I then did was I then set about creating this whole series of drawings that were trying to inform the prints that I was making. But what I eventually realized is that it was the work that was wrong. It was the drawing that I was doing that was actually giving me the indication of what I should have been doing. Does that make sense? So as I said, in one respect, the MA was fantastic in that it got me to really take apart my painting and think about what was important. On the negative side of it, it almost destroyed me. It made me completely stop and rip everything up and start again. But it was in that ripping up and starting again, I sound like an Orange Juice song now. It was that started to make me realize that actually, as I said, I very purposely decided I wasn't going to make art in inverted commas with big letters, that the work wasn't about what book I'd read. You know, it wasn't about critical theory. And I think that sometimes, for me, that's the sort of problem where the work isn't actually inherently that interesting. It's about the quotations that it's referencing. And for me, you know, I mean, as an artist, I mean, I respond to visual things. I don't need to know the history of what was going on in the world when this image was made. I know that that image is utterly compelling and I want to keep looking at
it. And I mean, it seems like you've been working over a period in which the relationship of kind of artistic fashions, I suppose, and the figure have shifted quite a bit. So I think perhaps in the 90s, was it much less fashionable, much less acceptable to be working from a figurative subject? And it seems like in the last 20 years that's changed.
I don't know. You see, the thing is, I suppose when I went to art school, where I went to art school, if you saw figurative painting, you largely, there was a, I don't remember anybody ever saying it, but there was a sense where the people working figuratively were not that interesting. The kind of figure painting that I saw was kind of almost lazy. I mean, you saw a lot of paintings of people's living rooms and their staircases, and it just always felt like they couldn't be bothered to go to art school. They just looked at what was around them. And it felt like the exciting stuff was the abstract stuff and the kind of, you know, and of course, you know, my head of painting was an abstract painter. You know, the kind of one of the best tutors there was a kind of almost constructivist artist. So, you know, I think there was that sense. There was a core of my year group that were being inspired by the sort of new wave of sort of German expressionist painting that was happening in the late 80s. You know, it was coming out of Italy as well, you know, the sort of Transvanguardia stuff. So, you know, people like, you know, Sandro Kia, Asger Jorn, you know, Penck, Baselitz, that sort of quite brutalist, sort of expressionistic kind of vein. I guess I was quite naive in terms of what I was looking at, but mostly I was looking at kind of abstract expressionist stuff at that time. So that wasn't really something that that kind of interested me. When I turned my back on abstraction and I started to make figure paintings, then it seemed to me that it was interesting that there were, you know, you had the emergence of things like the John Payer Portrait Award, and you had some really interesting artists coming out of that. You had people like Alison Watt was one of the sort of early prize winners of that. Tyshawn Schoenberg was one of the early prize winners of that. There seemed to be that, I mean, in the early 90s, I started showing with a gallery in Earls Court called Mertz Contemporary Art, and they seemed to be showing sort of quite young figurative based artists. So suddenly you felt like there was a lot of really interesting, you know, kind of artists out there. I mean, I'm obviously the same sort of age as people like Stephen Conroy and Adrian Wesneski, who were coming out of Glasgow. But also, you know, I mean, I wasn't somebody who kind of, you know, hit the kind of, you know, the sort of big shows and the sort of, you know, recognized as being the significant artist. So I'm not interested in the vagaries of fashion. You know, I've just, it's that sort of thing of, you know, various people have different trajectories in their career. And I suppose, if anything, you know, I had to chew through a lot of stuff. I had to get a lot of stuff out of my system to try to work out, you know, let's just try to be kind of the person I am, you know. And I think, I suppose, with my art history head on, you know, I think that some people kind of rise to the fore at certain times. You know, I mean, in the 1970s, I don't really think people were talking much about Lucian Freud or Ewan Uglow as artists of worth. They seem to have become much more significant in recent times. You know, I do think that, you know, obviously, if you look at Instagram, there's a lot of really, really interesting figurative artists out there. I mean, Rupert von Kaufmann is a really good example. You know, you've got people like Nicholas Uribe, I think really exciting. You know, you've got a core of people out there who are just getting on with it, you know.
I think that's such a great phrase to kind of end that moment on as well. Thank you. I want to invite questions if anyone's got any questions they'd like to ask. So if you wanted to type in the Q&A any questions that you might have for Phil. I've got
questions. So should I stop presenting?
Oh no, I think you're totally fine. I should have one pop up. I haven't had any yet. So if anyone does have any,
through some images just to keep you entertained.
yeah, that would be great. What is your relationship with color as well, Phil, in these images?
Well, as you know, because I must have told you, you know that I'm colorblind.
Yeah.
So I'm colorblind, but also obsessed by color and teach color theory. So for me, the interesting thing is, you know, I discovered that I was colorblind when I was at art school. And anecdotally, what's quite interesting is that, you know, I'm from a working class family in East London. And my dad didn't want me to go to art school. He wanted me to get a trade, and he wanted me to be an electrician like my brother, which I think is quite hilarious because I couldn't have been an electrician. For me, the interesting thing is that, one, I think, as I said, color is absolutely fascinating. And what I've found out in the last couple of years, which I think is extraordinary, is that our ability to perceive color is also linguistic. So I can't remember the name of the tribe, but there is a tribe in Africa that can't differentiate blue from green. And the reason being is that they don't have a word for blue in their language. So when you start to think about the idea of that, that's extraordinary, isn't it? That language gets you to understand color. Now, conversely, if you then think about the fact that when we start to teach color theory, we talk about a cerulean blue and an ultramarine and a phthalo blue and a cobalt blue and a crimson and a alizarin rose madder, a cadmium red, is the fact that we're introducing students to a whole series of new names for color actually potentially changing students' perception of color. So for me, there are certain colors that I can't see. There's a certain green that I can't see. There's a certain red that I can't see. They read as gray. If those colors are present in other colors, I probably can't tell that they're there. I don't see green in flesh, as an example. But equally, I know that for me, the absolutely key thing is get the temperature of the color right, get the tonality of the color right, and it will work. So for me, there's that great enjoyment of just placing one color against another color.
Pertinent to that, Pooja's just asked, how do you choose colors? And she says, and work so beautifully with color. But like, what does inform your choices?
Well, I think, first of all, I've taught color theory for a long time. And I remember at art school, one of my work colleagues, Aftab Sardar, said to me that colour was on the palette. It took me a long time to work out what he meant by that. But I'm a firm believer that colour is about mixing. And actually, my wife is incredibly good at knowing what 2-3 colours will go together. And I don't know what that is. I have to put a colour down and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, you change it. If you don't work, you change it. I'm just showing you here my Christmas cards. So every year, as Jake knows, because he's had some, I send out little original Christmas cards. Thank you. So often the little minute Christmas cards can be playful experimentations with colour. When I use colour, when I teach colour, that's where I have to make little abstract paintings where I'm playing with colour, just playing with one colour laid on top of another colour. So I think that actually teaching colour theory and learning about what colours you mix together and what you do when you mix colour, I think just the sheer amount of time placing colours next to each other starts to lodge itself somewhere in the back of the visual cortex, and you somehow think, okay, is that the right colour choice? So for me, I think I got over the fear of, oh, that's an appropriate word, empty. Get over the fear of mixing colour. No, this has got me onto yet another insane body of work.
And this is from the Portrait Artist of the Week, the sort of lockdown Sky Arts.
Well, actually, it is. And as I say, the bigger picture, as you probably know, I appeared on the television programme twice. So the first time I appeared, I painted Michael Ball. And I thoroughly enjoyed my time painting Michael Ball. And I thought I did a half decent job of painting Michael Ball. The second time I appeared, I painted Angela Griffin, and I found the experience really, really difficult. The painting, I ended up painting 3 portraits of Angela Griffin, none of which looked like Angela Griffin. And it got under my skin so much that I then decided to paint every single sitter in all the seasons. So I've ended up either drawing, painting, or digitally painting, I think over 240 odd portraits. So yeah, I did Portrait Artist of the Week, I did Portrait Artist of the Year. You know, it became a real obsession. And so, you know, I kind of worked through, and eventually sort of, I felt, started to get a sense of where likeness perhaps sits. You know, I needed to prove something to myself, really, you know, as you often do.
And now I'd like to dig further into that, but at the same time, I've got a question from someone to put to you, if that's okay, Phil.
Yeah, go for it.
So they've said thank you for an honest and insightful talk. They would like to know how you perceive the importance of drawing at art school and university right now, and how you think it's changing. And then there's a follow-up question, but I'll put that to you first. Where do you think it's at the moment?
Okay, so I suppose I'm shocked and surprised how few students draw. And I do think that, you know, if I think back to my time on foundation, I can remember the very first day of foundation where we all had to sit down and make a drawing. And where one had been like the best at art at school, because there was only 4 or 5 of us doing A-level art at school, suddenly you realise you're in a room with 30 other people who all could draw as well as you could. And some had a better understanding of drawing media than others. What I see in terms of my teaching is that many students don't know how to draw and don't think that drawing is important. So I find that shocking, because I think that for me, drawing is a real opener of inquiry. So whether it's just that sort of basic nuts and bolts of grammar, or whether it's about sort of gathering visual, I mean, like for instance, I teach visual research on the textiles degree as well. So one of my basic starting points is how to draw, and then why do you draw? As I said before, I think you have to have a sense of what you believe in. So I believe that drawing is really important. I believe that also drawing can be taught, that you can teach anybody how to draw. Students just need to be open to deciding that they want to learn that. And I think so. I teach life drawing at the university, and I start with the absolute basics of visual perception, and this is how you see, and this is how you should approach looking in order to inform your drawing, you know. And you know, last week I was teaching the basics of tonal drawing. And to a large extent, you know, the students who are wanting to learn that thing usually say how they've benefited from it. you know, and it's not about an atelier. It's not the sort of, you must draw like this, and this is the only method that you can draw, which you sometimes see with those, you know, like the Julia Estrade books. I mean, they're beautiful drawings, but everybody ends up drawing exactly the same way, you know. So I'm not a believer in that, but what I say is, you know, if you want to approach measure drawing, this is how you can approach measure drawing. If you want to. So I think it's really important, but I do think there's an awful lot of people who don't draw, and I think it's. I mean, there's a great interview from, I think, the sort of late '60s, early '70s with Saul Bass, you know, the great graphic designer. And he's asked the question, what would be your advice to students, Saul? And he says, learn to draw. You know, and he goes on, he said, like, you know, if you, it's, you know, it's a limiting fact if you can't draw. So I think, you know, there is an awful lot of people going through A-level art that aren't being taught how to draw, that are going through foundation courses that aren't being taught how to draw. And I think that, unfortunately, the educational system is making stuff that looks like art. And it means that when they get to art school, you know, I think that there's a real challenge, because some of those basic things, I mean, at my school, I was taught technical drawing. I was taught things like, you know, basic perspective. I was taught things like, you know, isometric projection and oblique projection, and those basic ways of engaging with seeing. You know, it's not all about observational drawing, you know, but it can be just about analyzing an object three-dimensionally. You know, those basic things can often be really missing.
So do you think that in order to give students greater confidence in their abilities to see and draw, and to kind of arm them better with drawing skills, that needs to happen further down the line, kind of pre-degree level?
I think it should do, but I don't think it is. As I say, you know, I mean, I've had two of my daughters go through the A-level art system and go on to foundation courses. And, you know, I mean, my eldest daughter ended up doing her dissertation on drawing in art school. And, you know, she said to me, the only person who taught me how to draw, Dad, is you. You know, and, you know, I mean, I know that on foundation, the part of the problem is, you know, when in the days when I was a foundation student, when you made your choice of university place the end of March, you had the time on a foundation course to experiment, to explore, to try different ways of working, and to really investigate. I mean, I always say that on my foundation, we all knew how to draw at the start of foundation. What we got from a foundation course is why we drew. We had a much broader understanding of how we could use drawing to inform the development of ideas. And by the time I got on my degree, you know, you could then take drawing to the next level, where you could really start to think about how drawing informed your work. But I do think that what's happening is that what we see, particularly from many, many schools, is that, you know, students come out where all their work looks the same because they've all been given a formula to work to get them to pass the exam. You know, you see these decorated sketchbooks, you see the contextual research, you see the notes, you see the sort of study, but actually it's like, you know, that it's something's missing from that equation. And I say that's what I believe in, is that you have to kind of, I think, you know, those issues around drawing are important, you know, because they can serve you for the rest of your life.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And within the institution at Brighton University, obviously you're a great champion of drawing there. There are some other great champions of drawing, Duncan Bullen and others. Do you feel there's a lot of institutional support for the
Yeah, I
notion?
mean, we have a series of what we call cores, so centres of research, and there is a core centred around drawing, and there's lots of different, you know, I mean, we have, you know, I mean, Duncan's obviously a member of that. You know, we've got Jeremy Radvan, who obviously teaches drawing as well. Lots of us really, you know, Philippa Lyons, sort of research mentor in terms of drawing. We had a really fascinating discussion this week with Dr. Eloise Calandre and Dr. Lucia King talking about drawing in their practice. So I think it's something that's really celebrated at the University of Brighton, and I think it's something that we really want to kind of pursue. But as I say, I think that part of the problem, and I think this is increasingly so, is that there has to be a recognition that students are coming increasingly to university with a skills gap. And I think particularly as well with the last couple of years where many students' education experience has been very fragmented. You know, there's a real need to sort of bridge that skills gap in much the same way that you could say about essay writing, that many of the students have not gone through an academic series of exams. So actually they're not as well equipped as maybe they would be to write academic essays, you know. And if they're expected to write academic essays, you need to facilitate that, you know.
So is there any advice that you would give to a student wanting to, say, go on to a printmaking course about how they could seek out those skills before starting?
Well, they could read your books, Jake. They could read my books.
They could read your books, Phil.
they could visit my website, my YouTube channel. I mean, I've put a lot of free content out there over the years. That's part of the reason why I've done it. I think it's like, you know, I've learned an awful lot by reading lots and lots and lots of books. You know, I mean, I've got, you know, the Harold Speed book and the kind of, you know, the I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, you know, oh God, what's his face? It's all gone completely. I'm surrounded by all my books at the moment. But I've read countless books on drawing and countless books on painting, countless books on printmaking. You know, I think that I think partly, are you interested? Are you interested in the subject? And do you want to find out about it? I think we talked about the fact that it's a constant learning process, isn't it? You know, if you know how to do something, it's boring. I mean, what becomes really interesting is how do I do this? In the same way that, you know, at Christmas time, when my daughter let me play with her iPad, I thought, this is a fantastic tool. I must update my iPad. I must get Procreate, because the flexibility of its drawing software is incredible. You know, and then you've got to learn how that works, you know.
And I mean, there's one that we're coming right up to 8 o'clock, but I'm just going to squeeze in one final question, if it's okay, from one of the attendees, just about how you balance your time or your identity as artist and educator, because you've spoken so passionately about both. Do you feel you are one or the other primarily, or are you both in balance? How would you describe your identity?
I am both. I think I don't see that, you know, I mean, I think that I'm a passionate educator because I'm an artist. You know, I absolutely, I mean, you know, I love looking at other people's work. I get really excited by looking at other people's work. Also, I think because I've only given you a slight glimmer of the things that I've done, because I've been lots of different kinds of artists over my 40-odd year career, because I've trodden a lot of different routes, and I think I've got quite good empathic understanding of the problems that students are facing. So for me, you know, there's no difference between my role as an artist and my role as an educator. For me, it's about, if I can communicate some of that passion that I feel to someone and get them excited by something, then I've done my job. Here's Milo, an ex-student of mine and a very well-known person to you. I mean, I didn't teach Milo very much. He knew an awful lot of stuff before I kind of came across him. But I think I maybe communicated some of my excitement about the subject to him. And I think he might have responded to that, you know.
I think that excitement is something that we're all going to leave with today as well, Phil. This has been so inspiring. Yeah, it really has.
You know, that's it. I think if it was boring, you wouldn't do it, would you? I mean, that's
absolutely.
Yeah, you know, you've got to get excited. I think that's the thing. It's like, and finding your way into a subject as well. You know, it's not being rammed down your throat to say you must like this. I think it's just generally getting really excited and surprising yourself as well. You know, finding out something, as I say, you didn't know how to do.
I just think that's a wonderful place to draw things to a close. And I wish we could keep going, to be honest, but I don't want to encroach into your time. And
no, well, actually, I'm quite hungry now, and I've got my wife and daughter wanting some food. But you know, more than happy to do this another time. If you wanted to talk about something else, I'm quite happy to do that.
I feel like we could go quite a bit deeper into a few different topics. It would be really nice to dig more into your drawing as well.
Drawing.
Yeah, there we are. A bit of drawing as well. I feel like we could go on for these forever. Well, I think it would be great to revisit some of these ideas as well. So I'll be in touch about doing that, Phil. But thank you so much for joining us for this talk this evening.
Well, thanks very much for your time, Joe. and I hope everybody's enjoyed themselves.
I think they definitely have. I've had a whole load of messages from people saying how much they've enjoyed it. And of course, I'm going to share this on the Draw Brighton YouTube. So for anyone that's been here this evening, if you wanted to revisit it or if you wanted to share it with anyone else, you'll be able to do that. And I'll include links to Phil's YouTube, to Phil's books on there as well, and his other social media so that you can follow him.
I should also point out, I mean, I just wanted to say, because you'll recognize these images as being a lot of the stuff that you've published through Draw.
Yes.
It's a fantastic venture to support the models. I mean, I worked with Mark Mellack in the last week before lockdown, and you know, he was basically saying at the time that was the last time he was going to get any work, and that's when he introduced me to your scheme, so, and that's when I joined it, really. So just a big thank you for supplying us with lots of great models to work from.
Well, without being too sycophantic, I mean, the models always speak very highly of you, of course, Phil, but also I think you have been a great champion at the university for fair pay for models rights, as well as for the importance of life drawing. So I think the whole community thanks you there as well.
Oh, very sweet of you. Well, so I think we've probably said enough without kind of blowing smoke up each other.
We should stop there.
Well, we definitely should stop, you know.